Well, thank you so much, Gil, for agreeing to be interviewed today for the Computer History Museum. It's really an honor to have you interviewed today. Today is July 28th, 2015. I'd like to start with your background. Your involvement in information technologies really started at a remarkable young age. You're programming, I think, as a teenager and started classes in high school at Hebrew University. What are the roots of your interests and capabilities in IT?
It's a good question. I've started getting seriously into computers when I was 10. So I learned programming. I think my father dealt with it. My father was a system analyst at a very different type of computing, big IBM mainframes and so on. So probably that's something that attracted me. I think as a young kid, I went to all these different activities and try different activities, and actually computers was probably the first activity that I chose myself. And like after school, when I was like in 4th grade or 5th grade, I took the bus for an hour. I waited 2 hours until they opened, and then I went for that computing class, which was even in a religious like community center in a completely different part of the city in Jerusalem. And that's what got me started. I really got into that. By the age of 13 or 14, I already felt that I've learned everything that I can and I know how to program. And I mean, by the age of 12, I already got my first summer job as a programmer in a company that actually did something very innovative back then, which was computer automated translation, what we know today as Google Translate, but that was 30-some years ago. That was a real revolutionary thing. But by the age of 14, I said, I already know everything. I need to challenge myself again. I can't continue. And then I decided to try and apply to learn at the university. And I've applied to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. For 6 months, I knocked on their door, literally. I mean, I said, I want to learn here. I said, okay, but you're 14, you know. You don't qualify. I say, sure, but I heard about some young people that already did that. I really want to. And they said, okay, we'll have the committee decide in X number of months. Every day I went there, I knocked on the door, I said, is there something new? As at the end, when the semester starts, they said, we haven't decided yet, but you just come to the classes, and that's how I've continued there.
That's an amazing story of your curiosity and persistence paired with your innate ability. If we fast forward and look at your sort of first product, and what were sort of the key elements that led to that fundamental breakthrough in your idea for what's now sort of the industry standard for firewalls?
So I started the Checkpoint when I was like 24, 2 years after I've served in the Israeli army. Like all the people in Israel when the age of 18 go to serve in the army, and in the army I did serve in computers, bringing my actually experience from the university and everything I worked with before to try and implement new technologies, especially everything about Unix system, IP networks, and so on, which were very new back then. So bringing it to the specific unit that I was in the army, and I want to change that. And by that time, 3 things have happened. First, for several years, I knew that I want to start my own company, or mainly not. It wasn't so much about the business, but more about developing my own product and being successful, developing a product that other people in the world use, and it's like the best in what it does. So that was one thing that I, for almost 10 years, looked for the right ideas to develop. I got this idea for a network security product when I was in the army. And one of the projects I got in the army was to connect to two networks. Again, the whole world of networking was rather new, and we've got IP networks that again were new, and my task was to connect 2 IP networks actually in the same building across the wall, but to make sure that the information doesn't leak or doesn't move. It was very classified networks, that the information that was between them is contained. I thought about what can I do. I've looked for a commercial system. I didn't find any good commercial solution. And then I came up with a simple idea how I can write a language that analyzes communication protocols and very quickly can determine on every packet that passes through the network whether it should get through or not. I implemented that in the army, and by the time I left the army, I had several ideas for developing a product, and this was one of them. That was the year 1991. At 1991, I actually investigated that idea, and my conclusion was that there is no exciting market around that. Going to big organizations, defense organizations that may be more sensitive to information security, it's doable. I mean, I can convince them that their network is not needs to be compartmentalized and more secured, but it's not very exciting. So I did other things for 2 years. I've even worked in some other Israeli technology companies. I actually even started a startup or a development center for an American, New York-based software company in Israel, and passed like 2 years like that. And then at the beginning of '93, I saw the internet coming. I saw suddenly that the internet is opening up. Up to 1993, the internet was pretty much closed. It was only for academic research. And by the end of '92, beginning of '93, the internet opened up and organizations were allowed to connect, and commercial internet use was suddenly starting up. And then I saw the huge potential of it. I said, especially as a young person in Israel, seeing the potential to communicate with the rest of the world, that was amazing. And remember, that was, by the way, before the web. I mean, today we know the internet around the web. That was when the web was just being invented. Nobody has a browser or a website. But still, I mean, the ability to communicate with my peers in other countries, to send email, to transfer files within seconds, the ability to be online all the time, looked to me like it will have a huge potential and it will change the world. And I said that internet thing needs security. And by the way, there was the need. Every organization that connected to the internet immediately said the same thing. We want to connect to the internet. There is 15,000 universities out there. I want to make sure that all these students don't get into my network. And then I said, okay, I got the idea. Here is a very exciting market that has a lot of potential to connect the world. And that's where I decided to start Checkpoint.
That's a perfect segue, where you've had this essential sort of breakthrough idea on the technology side. You've identified the market. Can you kind of walk us through the very early days of matching the market with your technology? What was do you remember your first business plan, your sort of pitch to investors, and you were there with your co-founders? How did all those pieces come together? So
yes, I did decide that I don't want to work on my own. Being alone is not fun. So I approached two of my colleagues and friends, Marius and Shlomo. And I told them, they already knew about the idea because we were discussing ideas beforehand, but I told them, I got this great idea, let's start the business around it. Marius immediately joined and says, I'm on board. Shlomo initially said, I'll join, and then he figured out he just joined a new company, just had the new baby born, and he says, I'm not sure I can afford starting something from scratch and being left without the ability to support my family and so on. So he decided to wait, and then like a few weeks later he said, he claims actually that I told him that this is a life-changing idea, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I don't remember ever saying that, but he claimed once in an interview that I told him that, and then he decided to jump on board. And then we started looking of how to develop it. So the first thing we did was actually take all our savings, and we found out that there was the first internet security conference in San Diego, California. So Marius and I took our savings and bought an airline ticket and went to this and flew to this conference to see what's going on, because one of the big things is let's not develop something that other people have. And again, remember, there wasn't the information to surf the internet and find what's available. That wasn't yet back then something that you can research. So we joined the conference. It was really interesting, and actually it reassured us that we are on the right direction, because first there were like 100 or more people showing up to the conference. That means that there is an interest. The ideas presented and the people presented were more on the academic side and less on the applied side, with ideas that can actually work in the real world, which I felt was good, because if we were coming there and finding 20 other groups trying to develop the same thing, it would make things different. So we came back with that with reinforcement. There is a potential for our idea. We didn't know what to do yet. There wasn't a venture capital really industry in Israel. There were technology companies, but it's not like It's today when there's thousands of startups and the whole ecosystem of how to start a company with people that will guide you and with venture capital and so on. So we figured out whether we should develop it after hours and keep our day jobs, and then when we have a product, start selling it. We figured out the market is actually moving fast. We need to quit everything we're doing and dedicate 200% of our time to developing that new product. We also figured out that in order to do that, it's best to raise some money. Just even the $20,000 we needed to buy Sun Unix computers wasn't money that was available to us. It wasn't developing on personal computers, which actually I also didn't have. So that's so we did realize that we'll want to raise some money and start working. We actually contacted 2 software companies that we knew in Israel and few other organizations. The other organization we didn't find a good fit. The 2 software companies that we knew that back then looked to us like a very successful role model kind of companies, where each one like few dozens of people and sold for $a few million. So that looked to us like a good model. And at the end of the process, we had a very tough negotiation. At the end of them, one company called BRM won and got about half of Checkpoint for approximately $250,000. And they turned to be, by the way, a few years later, they turned to be into venture capital full-time. They left the software business. And then we started developing the product. We've got loaner computers. We've developed a business plan, which is actually quite interesting business plan. We've really analyzed the market. We've had a plan of when will we have a product, how much resources we'll need, and so on. And we spent the whole summer, that was the summer of 1993, developing the software. That wasn't even in the office. It was Silicon Valley. There's the garage operation terminology. Our garage was Shlomo's grandmother apartment. It was a small apartment. We started in a tiny room next to the kitchen around April. By June, it became warmer, and also we got the new computers that we bought. They were generating a lot of heat, so we moved to the living room. And we spent the entire summer, and by the end of the summer, we actually had a nice product, or a prototype of a product.
So it sounds like a prototypical, startup where you're bootstrapping, looking for funding, looking for mentors, looking for role models. And yet you said you had developed a very good business model. As you look back at it, what was validated in those first early years as you looked ahead, as you thought how it might, and what turned out to be different?
So we did few things that were, I don't know if they are different, but kind of, for example, usually you'll write a business plan, you'll do a market research. So we decided, for example, not to do a lot of market research. We started with that conference that we went to, but then we said, if we're going to go and reveal our idea to new people, the market is not established yet. So most people will call and won't know what's the internet. So they might give us some feedback, but it won't be very relevant, because 6 months later, when we'll come with a product, they will be in a different position, the market will be in a different position, we will be in a different position. So we decided first to develop a product, then to do a market research. Once we had the product, we started taking it to customers, assuming that we'll narrow the gap. It will come up with a ready product, we'll tell, do you like it? If not, what should we change? And then we'll have a gap of a few weeks or a few months to change it, and not a year gap between the time we ask the question and the time the product is ready. Also, let's realize that we started in Israel, and one of the first ideas on our business plan was that we want to be successful in the global internet, and that's not in Israel. So we actually tried to turn that limitation of being very far away from the target market into few advantages. And the target market was clear to us. Our target market is the US market. That's where, that's where you read about new products. That's where people hear about that. So the entire world imitates the US when it comes to technology. So that's the market that we wanted to win. So all our market research, beta sites, everything we tried to do in the US, so we get the relevant feedback. By the way, many companies mistake and go more to do their first step in the local market. Sometimes it works. Usually you get some feedback that's relevant, something that's not relevant, and a lot of times you just get tied with the first few customers, And again, in our case, we wanted the first few customers to be the model for the next ones. So that was the ideas. Now, we had a lot of limitations on us. We didn't know how to run a sales force. We didn't have funding to hire a sales force. And we were far away from the market. So we made few strategic decisions that were pretty important. One is to try and establish a distribution network, finding local resellers that will sell the software. Second is to make the product extra easy to use. And again, when you talk about enterprise software and security software, that was definitely, it's not the situation today, that was definitely not the situation 20-some years ago. So we developed a graphical user interface with icons, which is very object-oriented. So instead of defining the security policy in terms of IP addresses and protocol numbers and so on, everything was colorful, was with names, was like objects. In terms of installation, I spent tremendous amount of energy making the product extremely easy to install. And that means it came on a single diskette, something that doesn't exist anymore. I had to, spend time on writing a code of the software itself that will compress itself so it will fit into the diskette. And compress the graphics, because the graphics took of the logo and so on, it will took some, until I was able to put it on a single diskette, make it such that you can put the diskette into the computer again, a Sun Unix server, not a PC, and install it in 10 minutes. And my idea was that my customer is, 10,000 miles away. They should be able to get the box, to open the diskette, to install it themselves, to figure out how it works. And they say, I really like the product. How do I buy it? Where do I send the check? That was the whole idea. Now, combining these two ideas of establishing a distribution network of local partners and having a product that's really easy to use with very good management capabilities created a huge difference that actually these days, as I said, 20-some years later, are still strategic advantages of Check Point. Because when the market started to heat up and the demand went up, our competitors that were doing security as a project, a team of experts would come to the customer site, install some hardware, configure software, and spend 2 weeks at the customer site. They were limited. I mean, of course, we believe that we had a better technology and a better approach, but beyond the basic technology, they were limited in the amount of teams they can send per week. We could have sent 100 diskettes and reach a much larger number of customers. And even more so with our distributors. Again, getting to access to different markets, to the Bay Area, to New York, to Chicago, and to other countries, and all covering the bases. When you have to go site by site on your own, it's very difficult. When you establish local relationship with a local reseller and send them the diskette, and for them it's not like a long training process to learn the new product, that becomes a great business model. And for the early years, that business model worked really, really well. Still is, by the way. So that's and that actually established the foundation to what we did in Check Point. So actually, we turned our limitation of being small, far away from the market, Israeli company into great advantages that continued, that became strategic advantages, not just things that were good for 1 or 2 years.
Thank you. That's such clear story about those advantages which have become your strengths. Just so for people who are listening to you now, could you give a little bit more detail when you're talking about compressing onto the diskette? What were the sort of technical specifications? What was the memory capacity of that diskette? What were the sort of speed processing of the Unix servers that you were using? Just describe what the world was like for the technology, for both what you were offering as well as for your customers and their uses. By the way, I wanted the program. I mean, one of the things I once said, security should be transparent, should be easy to the user, should not slow them down. So I said we need to work at wire speed. Wire speed, most companies connected with a T1 link to the internet, which was 1.5 megabit. We ran on a Sun computer, and a Sun computer has an Ethernet connection of 10 megabits per second. So I said the software should run at the full capacity of the Sun computers without slowing anything down. In terms of the size, the diskette was about 1.4 megabytes. So again, the whole software, including everything, has to fit into 1.4 megabytes, installs itself into the operating system. I've developed a lot of hacks how to, because the firewall software itself actually
needs to plug into the operating system, take all the traffic, filter it, and return it back to the operating system. There wasn't any, on the version of software we ran back then, Sun OS 4, there wasn't any interface to do that. So I have to develop my own hacks to install software into the operating system kernel, change the operating system code in a very illegal ways, I'd say that, and take the traffic and return it filtered. So it was 1.4 megabyte, the software compressed. It was running at 10 megabits per second, and actually it worked very well.
Well, congratulations for that. As you think about the evolution of the business model, Checkpoint has epitomized a company that's been in a fast-growing market in a rapidly changing environment. What key decisions over the past 20 years or strategic shifts have you been able to look at that are sort of inflection points as you have evolved the business model and strategy?
So as I said, the first decision, was about how to develop the product, and I think we made the right decision to develop a product that looks like, even though it's an enterprise product, to make it look like a consumer product that was extremely efficient, because the market turned to be much bigger than we thought and much more developed. So that really impacted the business model, that we could duplicate it and into very large scale, which still, by the way, a limitation of many of many startups, that they built a business model that tied to few large customers, and they are successful with these customers, but they don't have a scalable model in which they can go and install hundreds of accounts and then thousands of accounts. So that was one strategic decision, which, by the way, wasn't easy, because it's much easier to say, let's take the technology, find few large customers, install it to them. I mean, that's the typical one. We invested many, many months of time that we really didn't feel we have in making it a graphical user interface, in making it easy to use, in all these kinds of things. The second decision was to, on one hand, go on a distribution network. On the other hand, is trying to establish some strategic partnerships. Because the local distribution and the resellers, it wasn't that easy to get to that, because there weren't internet resellers. Actually, when I went to speak to people who sold computer networks, I said, this is the typical channel that I want to go. They all told me that there is no real market on the internet. Some that were extra smart told me, you know, come again in 2 years. Then it will be a good time to speak to us. And by the way, one of them 10 years later became our largest distributor in the world. But again, didn't help us to wait 2 or 3 years. So what we decided is, on one hand, to try and develop that reseller network. On the other hand, try to establish strategic relationship with companies that can take the product to market. One of these companies was Sun Microsystems. And they were by then selling almost 100% of the internet servers. They, of course, were a very successful company in the Unix space, but in the internet, they became the owner of the whole internet. Microsoft didn't acknowledge the existence of the internet in 93, 94. And the other companies like that were in the server business weren't really into much to open networks and the internet. So I've tried really hard knocking on Sun doors, and a few other companies too, and eventually Sun decided that they want to OEM our product and offer it through their distribution network, which was ideal. We decided that we want to establish strategic relationship that will give us a big jump up. On the same time, we decided that we are unwilling to give them any exclusivity, because that will jeopardize our entire future. They're a large company, they can decide to push it, they can decide to drop it at a certain time, and we need to make sure. So at the end of the program, there was a very long process of negotiating, and it was one of the a lot of interesting stories that we had about that. And at the end of the process, we established relationship with Sun. We worked very closely with them to make them successful, and at the same time we developed our own independent reseller channel. So we were able to grow both sides of the business. Even though Sun at a certain point became more than 60% of our sales, we always continued to push our own independent channels. And at a certain point, when Sun stopped selling our product and went out of reselling it, this actually, instead of being a pushback to the business, it became a very big accelerator to the business, because we could transfer all the Sun channels to ourselves and get even better business terms and better control and better support for these channels.
These partnerships are really important for young companies as they are evolving. You mentioned that there were some funny stories and difficulties along the way. Do you mind just giving some sort of color about how it was to establish that strategic partnership in the early days for you?
So initially I spent several months here in the Silicon Valley meeting with the product management and business management of Sun, established very good relationship with them. We spent many weekends here in Half Moon Bay and in San Francisco and so on. At a certain point we said, yes, we want to start business negotiation. We really want to do that. Then we figured out how do you run the negotiation. We had contacted our lawyer, which is not just a lawyer, he's a really mentor and business advisor. His name is Hanina Brandes. And we said, okay, how should we run that negotiation? He said, well, one option is to go to Mountain View and sit with them and run the negotiation. It won't run well because they will have all the time in the world and you will want to finish and do so. Another option, they wanted to come to Israel to see how we work. He says, don't even think about that. They're coming a big company, they'll see that you have a two-room office, we back and move from it up. There's no way you're going to get a good business. Even if they know that it's the three of you and they know you're not a large business, it won't run well. So at the end we decided we'll do it in the middle. We figured out we'll meet in New York. And then we did a very interesting trick in New York. Sun came to the room, 3 people, the product manager, the business development person, and their lawyer. We had 10 people from Check Point in that room. Sun were wearing jeans and t-shirts, like a good Silicon Valley company. We brought 10 people with ties and suits and everything. And the company, we had 3 people, but we brought the 3 of us, our 2 or 3 people from our investors, 2 lawyers from Israel, 1 or 2 lawyers from New York, 1 or 2 business advisors that we have here. So they went to the room and they figured out we are meeting with a large company that knows what it's doing. We spent the entire week negotiating. I was shocked because we got all these people that are experienced and relatively older than me. And we went to the room and they said, okay, Gil, run the meeting. When I was 25, 26 years old by that time. So we started the discussions and we went over and debated what to do and the business term. By the end of the week, we actually got to some business terms. Even though we were with like 7 lawyers in the room, at the end of the week, we had nothing written. So I spent the weekend with the hotel room with the business development guy from Sun, and we both drafted the term sheet that we had. So after the weekend, we sent the term sheets to all the lawyers for comments. They started the business negotiation again on for more formalities, and we signed an initial term sheet. I think 2 or 3 months later, we got even an advance check from Sun. They started selling. To get the full contract, it took another 2 or 3 months, and then I was invited. I had a tour around the world to sign up additional resellers and additional partners. We never stopped that. And I was on my way from Japan. It was my longest day in life. I started a day in Japan. I was about to fly. In Japan, you know, you spend the entire day, you take an evening flight, and you're supposed to get to San Francisco in the same morning. So I decided that that's not enough, so I stopped in Hawaii on the way and did the tour of Hawaii on the same day. Then I took the night flight from Hawaii to San Francisco, and I don't remember where did I get there, if it was still Sunday or Monday by that time. And I had a meeting with the head of Sunsoft that was supposed to sign the agreement, and I didn't wake up because I had this 48 hours. But we signed it the next day, and we went along the way, and and Sun became a very, very important partner for us.
That's quite a story, quite a story. How about other shifts in your business model that's evolved more recently in the last 10 years or even 5 years as your strategy is growing, more global market, different kinds of products with changes in technology?
So we've done a lot of changes and a lot of attempts to expand. I think so far most of our business is still in the core market of network security. The gateway that was the firewall 20 years ago, it became a much more sophisticated thing. It runs what we call software blades. It's like 10 different types of security capabilities, all integrated into this same platform that connects to the world. But I'll give you one example of a business decision that we had to make. For all the time, we're a software company. And people would take our software, run it initially it was on Sun servers, then on Windows machine, then on additional types of on machines that became the gateway to the internet. Actually, one of our strongest platform was developed by Nokia. Nokia decided to get into the internet business and developed internet connectivity business, and they tried to develop multiple things, but at the end what they ended up is a business that was mainly building dedicated hardware for security that ran 95% of that business was running the checkpoint software. And as the market evolved, the market shifted away from from software that runs on standard servers to more and more dedicated security appliances when people buy the whole box, including software and hardware. And for years I resisted being in the hardware business. I said the creativity, the innovation, the value of what we do in software, that is how we do. And most of our competitors, I mean, if I even name the largest one was Cisco, were all about integrated system. And in 2006, we really struggled with that decision, because we were the only one that's only software. All the others were selling integrated systems. And we decided to start developing our first integrated appliances, trying to base them on relatively open hardware and not having dedicated hardware developers. And we started that, and initially, by the way, we started that in the garage of one of our sales engineers in New York. He got open servers from IBM and other vendors. He got customers that really wanted integrated solutions. He installed the software, the hardware, combined it, put a sticker checkpoint, and that was the initial sales. Once we saw that there was a huge demand for that, customer really preferred to get the integrated solution and to pay a nice premium for that, because it saves, I guess, because it saves them two reasons. One, it saves them the total cost of ownership of maintaining the operating system separately from the server, separately from the security software. And the second was that they got one company to call on every problem. So when there's a problem, it's calling the vendor, one vendor, or not figuring out if it's an operating system problem, a hardware problem, or a software problem in the security. So we started developing an operation like that. That was a big change to our business model. The whole concept of being a software company, when you just click yes and there's a new software license and you are unlimited in your production, and you sell to a hardware when you have to actually stuck with inventories, predict what customers will want, be dependent on shipping and installation and so on. So we went into that business in 2006, 2007. It actually became quite successful. By 2008, we've actually even purchased the Nokia subsidiary that was doing dedicated hardware. And in 2008 and 2009, when the entire IT world was struggling with the economic downturn and all the companies were becoming small, we actually grew quite nicely with the integration of these businesses. And that was a very tough decision for me to change from a pure software to an integrated solution. But so far, I think we're 6-7 years into that, and it's working quite well.
Thank you for describing that integration from the hardware and software. You think about companies, great companies have defining not only great technology and customer relationships, but a kind of culture. How would you describe Check Point's culture, and can you share a specific example or story about how that culture has been defined and how it actually works in practice?
So first, the culture changes, but we definitely have some characteristics that are defining us as a company. I think one of it is that we're very analytical and try to analyze everything, and I always say think first, plan first, and then implement. Many people would like to do it, say, okay, here's a good idea, let's run with it, let's implement it, and if it works, great. If it doesn't work, we spend some time. I less like that idea, and I have all the reasons why I don't like it, mainly because if something is not successful, then you shouldn't have spent the time. If it is successful, you want it to be successful in the right way. You want it to be scalable, you want it to be, so you don't want to say, okay, I got here something that works great, but I started it with the wrong set of things and I can't scale it now. And then that's where companies start to grow businesses that are good businesses, but not in the right way. And always, by the way, the rule that we know in life in general, it's almost always easier to build something right than to fix it. Fixing things costs much more than buying or building the right the right thing. So not that we don't have to fix things, but we're trying to reduce the amount of fixing that we need to do. So for example, that characterizes us. That's not easy for people, because people bring an idea, and instead of telling them, great idea, go do it, we're telling, okay, it's interesting, let's do revision 2. Let's think about what can go wrong. Let's improve it. And that's a very challenging process for the people. The other thing is the other thing that I think characterizes Checkpoint is that we are strive for excellence. And striving for excellence sounds great, because we have great product and the best people and all the good things, but in the day-to-day life it's quite the opposite. Striving for excellence is always knowing that you can do better and you should try and do better. And that's one of the things that characterizes us, that hopefully it helps in achieving better results, but in the day-to-day it's quite difficult. And there's a lot of stories like that. We see it every day. But I have a story that was from year 2000. The year 2000, one of the greatest years for all technology companies. The market was booming. Everything was growing. We were doubling in size. And we did our first partner conference for European partners in Israel. And we were so happy that we can bring the Europeans to Israel. We took them to a city in the south of Israel called Eilat, which is like always sunny, always hot, with a beach and so on. And there was an amazing event. Everybody was extremely happy. It was like 3 days. We had the night, the desert. I mean, everybody was thrilled that business is going on. We had great product. Everyone was very, very happy. And then we went back. You got amazing feedback from everyone. We went back to the office, and there was a lady running our entire international operations at Checkpoint, and she gets an email from my partner, Marius, that says, here is the 15 things that we need to improve. It says, this presentation wasn't to the point. Here people stood in line for 10 minutes, they shouldn't have done that. And like 15 points like that about all the things that went wrong. And she was shocked, because we were all coming back from a great place, and here's this email about the 15 things that went wrong. So she sent, I'm not sure if she was even brave enough. Her boss, Jerry, was our president and running the entire worldwide sales, sent Marius an email back, said, Marius, I thought that the event was great and very successful. Looking at your email, seems that we weren't in the same event. So Marius sent him a one-line email back and said, no, this was a great event, the best ever. We just need to improve on all these things. So that's, I think, characterizes Checkpoint in many ways, and that's we're always trying to improve, and that's always challenges everyone.
That's great. This constant improvement, even doing better than your best in the past. Well, in a digital era when ideas and capital often flow quickly beyond borders, I think culture and place still make a difference. From your perspective, what difference, if any, has it made that Checkpoint's headquartered and its DNA is in Israel? And how do you think that Checkpoint's culture either mirrors or stands apart from the broader Israeli tech community?
So first, it was a big challenge, and I think I said earlier that one of the first decision was that we need to focus on the US market. We must be a global company, and that actually influenced a lot of decisions that we made. For example, in terms of managing the company, usually it's easy to work with people. If we're Israelis, then it's Israelis, and if we need to sell in the US, sell some Israeli to head the operation in the US and hire people. I didn't believe in that. I believed that if we work in different markets, there is a very heavy weight to the culture. And if we operate in the US, it needs to be with American people. If we operate in France, it needs to be with French people. And that's the toughest implementation, because I had to come and look for American people here in the US that are the best in what they can do for us, and not people that have any relationship to Israel, not people that are Jewish, not people that care about Israel. And like my first hire in the US was Deb Triant, which ran our US operations, sales and marketing worldwide, actually. And she has nothing to do with Israel. I mean, and it was very hard to, because when you connect with people, part of it is also culturally. There was nothing that connecting us. I was probably, I don't know, 10, 15 years younger than her. I grew in Israel, she grew here. I mean, it was completely different mentalities from a cultural standpoint, and still we had to build a business together. We became very good friends, by the way, because I think what nice thing I've seen over time that the cultures around the world are more alike, I mean, we can all connect as people and not keep the differences. But one of my main challenges in Checkpoint was keeping that global culture and understanding that it's not just Israel mentalities or American mentalities. We have to define our own culture. It's still very difficult up to today. And for most of my career, for almost 20 years of my career, I spent half my time traveling, spent at least a week, a month in Silicon Valley. And most of it was to, bridge the gaps between the different parts of the company. And I also didn't want to be, I mean, there's a lot of good things in the Israeli mentality, but I definitely didn't want to take the Israeli mentality and make it our mentality. The Israeli mentality, by the way, have changed in these 20 years, but the American mentality is much more organized, much more process-oriented. The whole communication is different between people. The Israeli mentality, sometimes it's improvisation, more friendly. Let's do that because he's my friend. And that's I said, excellence, I can't work with my friends. I only need to work with people that are the best in what they do. And even though, by the way, I started Checkpoint with two friends, Marius and Shlomo, I chose them very carefully as people that I think are the top caliber, are the right people. There are many, many other friends that are smart people, good friends in my profession, and I chose not to work with. So every decision that we made in Checkpoint had to be extremely professional and not based on improvisation and not based on friendship. I can tell you that one of my first hires in Checkpoint was a woman that back then I only wanted to hire for summer internship. She was learning in the US. I knew her from my childhood. We were friends when I was 12. And I didn't talk to her even for 10 years, but I decided that I can't hire her because I know her personally, so I only will let my other colleagues interview her and make the decision. I was so much wanted to make the separation between the personal friendship and the professional decisions that we made in Checkpoint, and I think that shows in the professionalism that people show. Interestingly enough, by the way, that woman started working as a summer intern with us, went back to school and went back to Checkpoint, and today it's more than 20 years that she's working in Checkpoint. She became a vice president, she changed many, many different roles, and that was the right decision. But the interesting thing was, even though I knew her many years before and I thought highly about her, I wasn't even involved in the decision to hire her. I wanted it to be extremely professional, and that's the nice thing, that 20 years later you can show that someone grew from the very entry level to be a part of the very senior management, all by the merits of what they've done and by how good they are, and not by any favorism or any other reason like that.
Absolutely. Before we leave this topic of leadership, I'd like to ask you about how you spend your time. You mentioned this, your time, executive's time is one of the most precious sort of, assets for you as well as for the company. What are the things that you feel that you are yours to be driving right now and spending your time with?
So first, it changes over the years. In the early years, I did everything, and that's why, I mean, I've built, I developed the product. I mean, we got to the product when we programmed it. There weren't any programmers. I did the first few sales, the first few partnerships. I hired the first few people. I started the marketing organization and, hired the first PR firm. And all these things I've experienced myself. I was even the CFO for several occasions in the history of the company. Then it was a different stage and by the way, my rule back then was very simple. I said I have like a 3 month, first the daily operations that you need to deal with, and then I have a 3 months goal and let's say a 1 year goal. And each 3 months I had a project. If it's to hire management for the US operation, that's a 3 month project. If it's to do a partnership with Sun Microsystem, that was a 3 month project. So every 3 months we have a vision that we need to establish ourselves in the US, that's the year long, but it's divided into like 3 months project, and every 3 months I need to complete one. And that was how I divided my time. And of course there's in the meantime I had to program and meet with customers and do a lot of other things like that. Then I went to a different stage of developing real management team, and in the early stages I worked very closely and I was very, very involved in a lot of details. And that's most of my career in Checkpoint. Again, the bigger we became, I couldn't be involved in every single detail, but I still was able to create an impression, right or wrong, that I'm involved, because if I'll take a product or I'll take an organization and dig deep into it, I'll do it once every 5 years, but in this time I'll ask a lot of questions, I'll spend 1 or 2 days, I'll ask people, I won't be shy of asking any question, and dig into that and show my experience. So I say, well, this is the way it's done, I don't remember that it's done like that, can you convince me? Sometimes they'll convince me, sometimes they won't. But the impression that people get is that I'm involved. Even if 2 years later I won't touch and won't check what we're doing, I'll still be involved. The last 3-4 years, or I think I've changed a little bit of a phase. I've got the management team here that's I don't know if it's better than the previous managements that we have, because all of them were good, but it's more, there's more delegation, there's more I mean, I got people that I really trust on the management, that they take much more decisions on their own. Usually it's the same decision I would take, but not always. Sometimes we take different decisions. And my role today is less operational. So I'm much less involved in every decision, do that and do that. I'm trying to be more involved in the more, one hand, holding the culture of the company and participating in that. On the other hand, figuring out what strategic initiatives I need to be involved in. So I would say probably 10-20% of my time is ongoing weekly management meeting, weekly hiring meetings. That's one of the areas I'm still involved. Every week we have a committee. We look at all the candidates to the companies. We go one by one and we decide to approve and sometimes not to approve all the hires. That still brings us together and makes us sure that we're keeping, that's the most important asset that we have, it's the people, so at least the jobs that we are involved and we care about who's being hired. So that takes, I would say, 10-20% of the time. The rest of it really varies. I mean, if it's the season that we have our customer conferences, then I'll travel and meet with customers and do presentations. If we're in the middle of thinking about next year plan, I'll spend a week or two thinking and strategizing what should be the big initiative. So that's a more dynamic time, the way I spend it now.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to a little deeper dive in innovation. It's really at the heart of Checkpoint and why the assets of people are so important. As you look back at not only at the first product, but how the products have evolved with the different sort of technology platforms and users, what innovations are you most proud of and why? Technological innovations.
There is a lot of different things that I'm proud of. I mean, we've turned the first platform that was a pure firewall access control into something much more robust, whether it's how to run virtual private networks that create encrypted communication between users and between different sites. It's newer technologies to identify threats. For example, if I'll focus about the last few years, we came up with a technology that's it's called sandboxing technology. One of the most difficult things today, it's really hard. I mean, conducting network attacks on the organization became harder. I mean, the firewall became strong and that's not easy to penetrate. So what the hackers are trying to do is to send you a file that may look like a normal Word document, and then you'll receive the file, you'll open the file, and the file will exploit some vulnerabilities in the operating system or in the Office software or in any other endpoint software that you run. So you basically get beyond you go through normal communication. So one of the keys to catch, now traditionally antivirus software would have catch these files because there was signature that says this file was identified before. The new type of malware, they know how to hide themselves better. Sometimes they are targeted, so the file is unknown when it gets to the organization. And in many cases, they are not even sending millions of these files, but sending few of these files, so it's harder to catch them because you simply don't get them. So one of the technologies that we have is how to take these documents that looks completely innocent, run them in a sandbox environment, and try to analyze their behavior. Are they behaving like a document or like something that tries to exploit other things in the computer? So that's, for example, one technology that we did very well. I'm talking about this technology because this technology exists today in the marketplace, and other vendors are also doing that. And we can argue whether we're doing a better job and our developers have developed unique characteristics, which I think some we do, and there are companies that are even bigger than us in that specific technology. But one of the things we did this year, for example, was say, let's completely change that paradigm shift. But taking that file, running it in a sandbox environment, it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of time. The file is delayed for many, many minutes. You need to run it for an extended period of time to see what changed in that time. It may not start to do the bad stuff in the first second. It may start to do it 5 minutes later. And let's think about new ways to do that. And one of the ways we took, and that's what I usually like to see about innovation, that we came up was let's completely restructure the file. The malware that's inside the file is really dependent on specific structures, on things that are very, very delicate. If we take the file that looks like an innocent file, and like we're doing print it and then send it, then the whole malware goes away, because it won't. And that's what we develop. We call it threat extraction. Now, that method is much simpler. Again, it's not completely simple, but it's relatively simple. You can reconstruct the file. Once you reconstruct the file, usually the bad impacts that file could have are going away. And that's what we did. It's called threat extraction. We found so far 100% success rate. So I mean, we took all the known and unknown and new malware that we can think about. We ran it through that threat extraction engine that sends the end user a file. And the malware is not there anymore. It's not effective anymore. And that runs fast and it's reliable. And at the end of the day, as a user, that's what you want. You wanted to see the file. You may get an explanation that says this file was actually reconstructed. If you, for some reason, you need the original, click here and get the original. But usually you don't need it. So that's one kind of innovation that's just think differently, much simpler. Let's not go on the route, which we are, by the way, still doing for analysis and things like that of the threat emulation, going a route like that. I'll give you another innovation that's I helped shape. I didn't write any of that, so it's all the credit is to our developers. In the world today, there is a big problem, and a few years ago it was even a bigger problem of information leakage. People sending by mistake or not by mistake data, documents outside the organization. This year we saw huge incidents around that, but we saw a lot of them. How do you combat that? So companies develop technologies that are very sophisticated, labeling all the company documents, analyzing the text of the document. They're not really effective because a computer cannot understand what human beings are trying to do. So let's say you mark a document and you decide that this document looks sensitive, looks like it has financial information. What do? If you stop it, you stop the work, but it can be me sending the information to the accountants. It's sensitive information, it sends outside the organization, but it's still right. If somebody else sends it to, and leaking it to somebody else outside the organization, it's very bad. So how do you determine? So one method is to define very complicated rule. Who is allowed to send, who is not allowed to send. Usually what these systems do, and a lot of the security systems in general today, they see bad things, they don't know for sure that it's bad, so they let it pass through and they create an alert for somebody to check it out. Then the security administrator is faced with hundreds of incidents a day that they need to go through, and they simply can't. They see. And it also involves privacy issues. Do I want somebody to read my emails and make a decision if it was right or wrong? It's a privacy issue. So I came up and said, let's take something much, much simpler. If the system determines that this file is suspicious, and suspicious maybe yes, maybe not, let's ask the user. So instead of trying to go the hard way of the computer makes the decision, the computer will ask the user. When the computer asks the user, think what happens. If it's a mistake, you say sorry and you drop it. If you're intentional hacker, you know that you shouldn't say, I want to do it, because you know that people are watching you. There's an audit track recorded. Not only that, it educates the user. Now tells you you're not supposed to send files of the company outside. You can say, oh, I did it by mistake. Now you have to give a reason why you're doing that. And the reason I'm sending it to my private Gmail account to work at home is not a good reason. So, for example, that technology created a complete shift in that, in our ability to deal with it. And the number of, by the way, of information leakage incidents went down by, when we checked it on our organization, by 99 or 99.9%. And now what you have in every week is 10 or 20 records that the security administrator needs to go through, and that's very easy to determine. They say, CEO sending financial information saying this is for accountants, very easy to say, okay. If you're seeing an employee without the right, and it says this is financial data employee that's unrelated and with the reason that looks bad, then you can check that incident. Usually doesn't happen because employees, or when people are trying to do bad things, they're not stupid. If you're telling them you're not supposed to go out with it, stop, then they stop. They don't try and go through. So this is, I'm giving that example because this is thinking differently than the traditional ways of making things, you know, more sophisticated, faster, and so on.
Those are wonderful examples of this thinking differently, thinking out of the box, and thinking in a very elegant in a way. Important innovations occur not only in technologies, but business models, as we've talked about earlier, as well as business processes. Are there any other innovations of that particular type that you'd like to talk about for Checkpoint, especially in the more recent period?
I don't know, as I said, in the more recent time, we've changed our business model a little bit from selling pure software to selling integrated system. We've tried to keep it very software-like, so still out of, let's say, 1,200 developers that we have, there's not many hardware developers. We do all outsourced because we want to keep the value in the software itself. I think in the early days of Checkpoint, we did that. When we developed the channel, it was a great, it's not innovation because we are not the first company to use a channel, but we really built the channel from scratch. I mean, the first few channels that we have were innovators, or not innovators, were pioneers in the world of internet. And taking the business model of enterprise software and security and making it sort of off-the-shelf product was a big business model innovation that changed our market landscape. These days, everybody's trying to imitate that. Everybody's trying to go after the same channel. Everybody's trying to go. I'll tell you one idea that's not necessarily from recent years, but also from the late 90s. We figured out we grew very fast because the internet started to grow very fast. And the customer came with more and more requests. And some of these requests, as of course we have to do it, some of these requests were, we can't really do it ourselves. How to connect to a sophisticated authentication system. We said there's other vendors that are doing authentication. We can't do it on our own. There were a lot of different ideas like that. So we said, you know what, let's start, which obvious, let's start partnerships. And then we said, you know, let's not just do ad hoc partnership, let's define a program. We call it OPSEC, Open Platform for Security. We'll be the platform, and we'll create many different APIs, many different interfaces when partners can communicate with our product and work together. Now, the reason I'm saying that because the big innovation was actually in what it did to the business model. We got about 300 OPSEC partners, technology partners that worked with us. Some it was ad hoc things, some it was things that actually became very big. Very few companies that their entire business model were based on cooperating with us. But the interesting thing was that when we started that, we were a company with about $30 million in sales. Not a big company, not a small one by these days standards, but definitely not a big one. And what's happened was that overnight there were hundreds of companies that were working with us. So when you are a customer and you ask somebody about your solution, you say, who do you work with? They say, Checkpoint. And suddenly after you go to 5, 6, 7 companies and you ask them, who do you work with? And all say Checkpoint, say, maybe I need to check that Checkpoint because everybody's working with them. And at that time, it made a huge difference in the marketplace. And that was a great innovation, not in the technology, but in the business model, that everybody talked about us, much bigger than our room in the world. And some of these companies that we worked with were big companies, were much bigger than us.
Well, thank you for sharing that example about this open platform for security. With tremendous pressures now to compete and deliver value, what lessons would you say that Checkpoint might have for other companies about how to innovate?
First, innovation is difficult. There is no one way of innovating, and we always need to listen to multiple constituents. I mean, I'll give you one thing that I'm trying to encourage people to do is to get the developers and the technology people as close as it can to the customers.
Physically or
Communicate. I mean, we've seen physically, by the way, that's again, disadvantages versus adventure. We are in Israel, so the developers are far away. So I said, we need to bridge the physical gap. We then acquired a company in San Francisco. We said, for them, life is great. They can talk to the customer every day. And they had the customer, a huge customer across the street. They were the largest customer. And suddenly there were big issues, problems with the customer. And I asked the guys, the developers, did you speak to the customer? And we said, of course, our technical support people speak. I said, no, personally, did you went there? Did you try to fix the problem, try to understand what do they need? And I said, no, never. It goes, there's like 4 different layers of interfaces, how we communicate. And then I realized that the plan that I implemented 4 years before that is not, it's not the physical distance, it's how we communicate. So for example, we have we call it a field program. Every week we will send one developer, they'll go a week and meet with customers. That usually doesn't happen in other companies. The developer never sees the customer. Now the developer, when they meet the customer, they understand firsthand what the customer really need. I mean, in communication in general, I would say that 30% of the information is getting lost with each hop of the communication. So if 3 people handle the customer request until it gets the developer understands the direction, but they understand 20–30% of what they really need to. If they meet with the customer firsthand, they can say, oh, I get it, and they can do things much faster. By the way, they're also being much more proud that they see people actually need what they're doing and so on. But so it's not the way to create the entire organization works by, but it empowers people to think about the real world problem, not what just their product management and the head of R&D tells them to do, but to think like the customer. So this is an idea that I encourage people to get things closer. Again, doing it in a structured way, not in a way that the programmer now become a contract programmer for every customer, but in a way that encourages the communication. I think less resources always drives more innovation. I think one of the big obstacles, and even for us today when we're a larger company, when you got a lot of resources, you always go to solve every problem by the book. Okay, I have this problem, it will take me a year, I'll need 30 people. And that doesn't create innovation. That creates a lot of work. Sometimes it creates good results, sometimes it creates mediocre results, not always great results. When you say to someone, it's you, and the customer needs it tomorrow, then the real breakthroughs happen. So less resources helps. And by the way, I see it in Checkpoint. We're now a larger organization. So when I come with an idea, it's always this. I need 10 people. It will take a year. And I always say why I don't understand. And I always end up with 10 people for a year. And I guess there's good reasons. We have very smart people. Whenever we have a security issue, a severe security issue that was found in the world, suddenly all these processes that usually take 6 months and a year suddenly happen overnight. That shows the DNA of the company. When people hear critical security breach and we need to fix it for the customer, immediately, or not just for one customer, for the world, immediately the developers come for 2–3 nights in a row. They understand how to do things differently, and all the processes that usually take 6 months suddenly condensed into something that they launch the next day. And that shows the real thinking outside the box. Now, I don't know if it's, I don't think it can be done every day, but sometimes it needs to be done, and that's another thing. So I encourage companies, and by the way, the biggest mistakes that many startups do today is that they have too much resources.
So that's one of the challenges, isn't it, for a big company to somehow be big but still act nimble and small and be flexible. How are you addressing that for Checkpoint now?
It's a constant challenge. I mean, it's not easy. Again, I think we create a lot of links between customers and users. I give, for example, many years ago, I set a rule to my development. They come and say, okay, here is this user, they want to that. Should we develop it for them? It will slow us down from developing things that we're developing for the whole market. I say, first, you never know. You're developing something that you think the whole market will need. Here is something that somebody really needs. But then in order to solve it and not to have a daily discussion about 10 different things, because at the end with 1,000 developers you develop 1,000 different things every day, I said something very simple. 10% of your resources, up to 10%, will be allocated to everything that the field organization, that the customers ask you. When you go beyond 10%, we reallocate resources. We're doing that for 5, 6, 7 years. We haven't got to the 10% yet. And I think people are happier because customers can now easily get answers to what they want. And the developers know that 90% of what they work on is the future generation and not the day today. So this is one example of how to be a little nimble about that. It still takes a lot of load when you have to allocate a single developer, but at least it's not the top management at every point of time.
That's really helpful. Thank you for adding that detail. I'd like to now talk about what we might call ecosystem. You've mentioned along the way the important role of early investors, some of your customers, you've alluded to competitors. Can you sketch out for us a little bit of the 360 view of the ecosystem now for Checkpoint and how the different roles of the interaction of the company with these other organizations have made a difference? Maybe even give an example of a key inflection point.
So first, for a CEO or for a company, we have to serve our customers. We have to work and serve our employees. We have our shareholders. As a public company, we have shareholders and board of directors that are not the same. I mean, as a private company, usually your board of directors represent your investors. As a public company, the investors are not represented on your board of directors. And it's definitely one of the challenges for a CEO is to get that whole ecosystem and to create some unity, something that works. So first, my priority is always, let's develop the right things for the customers. At the end of the day, that's what drives our, if a customers would love our product, and they'll buy more of them, everything will turn out well. Developers will be happy that what we're developing is successful, we'll get the money from that and will be successful business-wise. And if we'll do that, the investors will also be happy at the end. It doesn't mean that I don't have to meet. I mean, we're a public company since '96, so for 19 years now. That means that every quarter we have to meet quarterly demands that are very challenging and so on. But the first thing to remember is what the value we're trying to build is the value for the customer. And if we build that value and then do the other things that we do, we'll create a lot of value for shareholders. And in Checkpoint, it works. We're a very profitable company. We are enjoying most of the time good support from our shareholders and so on. So that's the first rule that I have. For investors, my rule is very simple. Try to be a business that's supported by your customers. From our first sale, we were profitable. And I, by the way, refused to hire people before I knew that I have sales that I can pay their salaries. I didn't want to pay people salaries from the investment money that we raised. It says that we can go out of money, and then I'll have a problem. I'm challenged not with what value my product really does, but what's the perception that my investors will have, and will they want me to give money or not? And I said, for me, it's okay, I can live with it. I don't want my employees to be dependent on that. I want to make sure that I always can pay my employees their salaries every month, and I don't have any issue with that, and they are dependent purely on our success. So my rule will be on that is try to be self-sufficient as a company as soon as you can. It's not always the first sale, it's not always day one, but companies that keep raising more and more money, I always find it frightening, because at a certain point something is going wrong, and that's the point that you're going to have the most challenges. That's the point when it's scary to you, when it's scary to your investors. If you're supported by your customers, that means that you're generating real value, because in our world, whether we like it or not, the value of what we produce is decided by whether people decide to purchase it and pay for it. And I think that's what I'm trying to, up to this day, implement in Checkpoint. If we have a new product, yes, we can invest, we can have a lot of people. But if these people are working right, then very quickly we need to see sales after we developed it. But it's not... so that's... Now I have a board of directors with some members that are on our board for 20 years now, almost 20 years. You mentioned Ray Rothrock from Venrocks and Erwin Federman for USVP. They are with me for 20 years by now and supporting us. And that's been another interesting experience of how to interact with board members and investors.
Well, I'd like actually to follow up on that. Ray and Erwin are both advisory board members on this new center and have talked really about your ability to connect what's happening in Israel and what you're doing there with investors here. You mentioned customers. Can you talk about a little bit more about your connections with investors or here in Silicon Valley?
So it's a different perspective back then when we started and now. But basically, when we started, as I said, we raised money only from BRM, which were an Israeli company. A year later, BRM decided that they want to not to cash out, but to diversify their investment and sell some of their share from Check Point for additional investors. And then they decided to bring on additional investors, which back then were never invested in the company. They bought shares from BRM, the original investors. At that point, we were kind of exposed to the world of venture capital of Silicon Valley, and that was a whole new world for us. Even before that, we got Ray especially, he was trying to hunt for the good company, so he was trying to speak to us even before that all happened, because he identified Check Point as an interesting company. We were always polite to these venture capital people. We thought they may help us with contacts, but we never needed them because we never wanted to raise money. And then we got into this game of BRM trying to sell the shares. The investors wanted to know the company because that's what they're interested in, and trying to do their due diligence. And we, on the other end, really didn't care because we didn't try to raise money. So it was usually it's the other way around. The company is trying to raise money and is very interested in dealing with the investors. We said, why? Don't distract us from running our business. But at the end of the day, we didn't have choice, so I learned all this process of how to work with investors, and it was quite interesting to see. I mean, first I met a lot of smart people. The investors here in Silicon Valley and these days also in Israel, they are very sophisticated, they are very smart. On the other hand, they also behave in the very much the herd mentality. They all go to the same ideas, to the same thing. I got amazing calls from people that would call me, say, you know, we won't invest in valuation more than X. It's interesting company, but it's not worth more than that, which I didn't care because I wasn't raising money. And 2 weeks later, another investor comes and raises the offer for the investment, and they all come and say, okay, we will match it. 2 weeks later, the price, by the way, in our investment, when we started when there was an investment bank was trying to help BRM raise the money. They said, we think the company will worth about $12 million when you want to raise money. We ended up that investment round at $50 million. Which was, and I got investors that were telling me 25 is by far the highest amount I will pay. And by the way, I always said, don't speak to me. I don't care. I'm not raising money here. I don't care what valuation you buy. I'm staying with all. But we are not. But you must take us at this price. We're the best. We will connect you to the entire world. And even, by the way, I got behaviors of venture capitalists that was horrible. People threatening. If you won't get us, this company will screw you. Or this, I mean, amazing promises and amazing threats that the investor made. And investors, by the way, that are very distinguished, some of the top investment firms that they were there and still today in Silicon Valley. Some I thought were on the edge of being even illegal of the promises they made. Finally, we've got to the stage when, now, the stage when there were lined up a number of investors here that we already met with, and they were ready to invest, and they all met the same valuation criteria. And our investors, the original BRM, told us, you know, you have all these investors. I think Venrock was the lead investor. You can choose which one to get in. I mean, we want people that you'll get along with. If they're all the same terms, you choose one. And it was a very interesting lesson for me how to choose, which I'm still trying to remind myself to do in life. Because the people that we're talking were all the first grade Silicon Valley investors. And they had good reputation. They all met with us. And of course, they are all saying nice things at this stage. And then we called, I won't name any names because, and then we called one company, very famous company, that two of these investors were on their board of directors. Initially asked how are they, and say they're first grade investors, they're all great and so on, so you can't make a decision. And we asked, between this guy and this guy, who would you prefer? And amazingly says, there's not even a question. Says this guy always will when something goes wrong, he will always try to blame you, and he will always try to replace you, and he will always, and this guy will support you, and so on. So that was an amazing thing to see, and that's why we chose Venrock and USVP. They got very good ratings in this process. That's, by the way, a choice process in life that we always need to do. When you get somebody that has experience with two individuals, or they try two products, they're the one to give you the recommendation. If you ask somebody, are you happy with your car? Most people will say yes. If you have somebody with another car, they also say yes. If you ask somebody that owns two cars, which one is better, then they can give you, they also say yes about both cars. So which one is better? Now they'll give you the real advice, which one is better. And that was, and we don't usually do it in life. We're trying to make a choice and then get people that will say, yes, that's a good choice. We're not trying to people that will challenge us, but I'm very happy with where we ended the process. Then we went public. It was a whole different process of working with the financial market, not with venture capitals, but with Wall Street investors. That's a whole different lesson to be learned.
As you think about lessons to be learned, many younger companies look at Check Point and it's as a role model, and as a catalyst, really, for the whole Israeli tech ecosystem. What do you see for you as a pioneer, and also Check Point, its legacy in Israel for building that tech ecosystem over these last 2 decades?
First, a little embarrassed when people look at it this way, but I think that I'm generally quite proud first in what we achieved. I mean, we have a successful company, but I'm also proud in how we achieved it, because I think that we really worked hard to achieve that. We weren't just dependent on miracles or huge investments or things like that. I really feel that the team at Check Point has worked for everything we've learned. I think we've shown both to Israel and to the world that you can, that if you are building the right value, you can build the right company. So I mean, it's not about raising a lot of capital. It's about finding. In what I said earlier, it's how to take your disadvantage and turn it into the winning advantage. I mean, you are small, you can be nimble, you can act fast. You don't have access to the market, establish a distribution network. That's much more powerful, by the way, when you can scale to the entire world. I mean, hiring people, paying them, figuring out how they work is much more costly and takes much longer than signing up to resellers in Japan, to resellers in France. And if they work, great. If they don't work, even that is not the end of the world. So. And we, by the way, were very quickly, when we started selling in '94, a year later, half of our sales were in the US, where that was most of our focus, but half of our sales were international. Because the resellers from all over the world were calling us and say, can we distribute your software? And we did our due diligence to see that we're the right company, that we have the right skills, that they're good people, but that takes 2 days. Hiring a person and training them takes months. And that's, so I think when people have the right idea and the right time and the right market, things can succeed. Unfortunately, in technology, we have a lot of great ideas, but not all great ideas can succeed, and not all ideas are revolutionary, because they don't get to the market on time, or because mainly because the market need for all ideas is not equal. And there's a lot of good ideas that can make small improvements, but small improvements usually are not enough to create a big successful company.
As we just end this section on ecosystems, I'd like to use your lesson that you just shared with us about comparing. Take somebody who has active, direct experience in 2 places or 2 products, to ask you if you would just evaluate or compare the strengths or weaknesses, vulnerabilities of Israel and Silicon Valley as ecosystems for developing technology companies.
So I think both are very good ecosystems. In general, if I look at the differences, of course, there's a lot of skill set here in Silicon Valley in every area. There is better access to the markets here. It's in the US. That's the good thing. Some of the challenges in Silicon Valley, it's much more expensive. Loyalty of people is lower. It's not that loyalty. There are loyal people here, and we have people working in Check Point here for many years. But in general, the whole mindset of Silicon Valley is we are looking for the next big thing, the new thing. And that means that if you're working someplace for a year or two and it doesn't become the next Google or Facebook, you get some feeling that you're missing out on the opportunity and you want to move on. In Israel, and even if you are part of something like that, even if you are part of Google and suddenly everybody speaks about Facebook about being the next big thing, you think that you may be missing out. In Israel, there is much more loyalty for people. I mean, people are much more, I mean, being with the same company for 10 years is a source for pride. It's not a source for thinking that you may be missing out. So people tend to be a little bit more loyal. The whole cost structure of running a company is more reasonable, which is, I think, also important, not because I think that too much resources, as I said, is the #1 things that kill companies. These are the main two differences. There's other things like the Americans tend to be much more structured and process-oriented. The Israelis tend to be much more improvising and knowing how to come with new ways to solve the same problem. There's no one system that's better. I mean, when you want to scale a company, going by the system and having a process is extremely important. And I think I'm a very process-oriented person, and I'm trying to implement that. On the other hand, you can't do everything by the process. When you start a new company, of course, the technology has to be innovative and a breakthrough and not well-known. But sometimes in the business process itself, you have to innovate, and not just in the technology. And that's where Israelis are good at. So I think both places are great. And I used to come here, as I said, once a month and really love it here in Silicon Valley. And personally, I like Israel more because I was born there and that's where my friends and family are. But Silicon Valley is also a great place.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight. I'd like to now turn to this last section about looking ahead and start by looking at sort of the changes in technologies with the rise of the internet, cloud, and mobile. Certainly been change in the role and kinds of technology for firewalls. With the Internet of Things and other developments, can you share sort of what you see as top priorities for the next areas for focus for innovation in terms of technology and addressing security risks?
So definitely the challenge in security is not becoming easier these days. We see that security is becoming both run by professional hacking teams and by strategic countries and organizations that are using a lot of resources and very advanced methods of attacking other organizations. So security is clearly becoming more and more important as opposed to a side issue that's already solved. In terms of innovation and what we need to do, so first we need to learn how to better filter the information, not just to say this is an attack or not an attack, but knowing that the information we are getting to and the information that gets to us, the risks may be in the information. So that's definitely a challenge that we have. I think the whole mobile space is becoming a huge challenge today. I think we kind of, if you look at the enterprise space, we protect our networks, we know who's coming in and out, we need to improve the technologies, we need to use much better technologies to screen the data and the documents and the executables and everything that passes through the network, but we have control over the network. Mobility creates a complete shift in that. We still need to keep the network secure, but on the other hand, we walk with these mobile phones. Suddenly they hear everything we say and said around us, they see everything we see. Most of our business data also goes through them. They can listen to the network, and they broadcast all the time. They're always connected, and not necessarily through the company firewalls, but through the mobile operators network and connect to the entire world. So I think the key ingredients in protecting the future will be to handle the security of mobile phones so they don't become the backdoor for all the hacking activity. And by the way, we see it even internally. We've just recently came up with the mobile threat prevention product, with one of the only very few products in this industry that actually can detect malware on your mobile phone. And we tell our employees, just install it. And some employee says, but why? I don't have business data, it's my personal phone, why do I need to install it? And we have to explain to them, that device is with you all the time. So if you don't care about protecting your own privacy, maybe you should, but not even your own privacy, or with that device at work, all your work conversation can be recorded. And we had an amazing demo of it. You don't realize that problem until you see the demo of it. You take that device with a simple app that looks completely innocent, and 2 minutes later I show you that our entire conversation is recorded on the internet, and everything is exposed. So that's really scary for both business and individuals on personal. So I think Internet of Things is also another thing like that. We are learning, and we invested a lot in protecting the personal computers, how to protect servers and so on. Now we get to this Internet of Things. These devices cannot run endpoint software on them. They are very simple. They cannot run additional software. They are devices that are built for one purpose. So we need to find a way to protect them as well, and maybe learn their communication patterns, and maybe identify when they are used in the wrong way. So that's another area. Critical infrastructure in countries and everywhere is also a very important factor that's becoming on. I mean, everything. I mean, our power grids, our water systems, our traffic systems. We did a demo a few months ago for one of the largest car manufacturers here in the US, that we showed how we take a 5-year-old car and take over the car through the network. That's which is scary too. All these systems have to be protected, and most of these systems, by the way, are not protected because, again, they run very simple software, which is vulnerable, and they don't. It's not like we used to. This is a personal computer. Download the security suite for that. So we need to learn how to defend in all these vectors. On one hand, more sophisticated attacks. On the other hand, more and more places that we have to be. And last and not least, by the way, is the cloud. We are giving, if it's infrastructure clouds, then we trust infrastructure of other people. Then we can relatively easily protect that, because we can run similar security measure that we run on physical server on the infrastructure servers. But when we trust our great vendors around the world and we put all our files on their servers, on their applications, by definition it's on their application and they control it. We trust them. They are doing a reasonably good job keeping our data, but our data is at the end of the day exposed, and we need to worry about that. Now, there are certain things that can be done, and I think we're doing in Checkpoint a lot of things to defend all this environment, but there is a very long vision and roadmap that we have in which we elevate the level of security that we get at each stage.
As you say, cybersecurity is more important than ever. The demands are there. Congratulations, by the way, on the most recent stock performance for Checkpoint. I think there's validation from the market, from investors, from companies that have experienced cyber threats, JP Morgan, the US government personnel office. So there's a greater need than ever, validations from many sides. And at the same time, when things are like this, often there's some kind of unforeseen disruptor, whether from the threats or from kind of new innovators. Are there some things that you kind of have a hint of sort of disruptors on the horizon, what they might be like?
No, I don't. I wish I knew. I mean, I'm sure that there are, but no crystal ball. I always said I don't know to read the future. I know where things are heading. I know that we need more things, but I can't read the future. So I mean, a lot of things can surprise us next month and next quarter, next year and in 5 years. I think we know some of the directions. I think we know that we will see some strategic attacks on our critical infrastructure in countries. I think that we know that mobile devices, that's a great example of it. I know we will see major attacks on them. We haven't seen big attacks on them. We've seen small ones. We've seen small malware. It's enough to demonstrate that it's doable, and it's enough to show that the risk is there. So these are things that I'm saying are very, very tangible. And I think we need to preempt that. And that's, I think, one of the issues with security. On one hand, we never like to think about the risks. And by the way, personally, I hate to think about the risks. I'm thinking very positively. I'm thinking about how to build this strong system that will defend us. I don't think about how this hacker works and how that hacker works. And I think that's one of the strengths of Checkpoint, that we are not dependent on understanding single individual, single vector of attack. We're trying to build more generic architectures that can defend against known and unknown attacks. But we know about certain things that will happen, and we need to defend against them. I think the whole concept, the whole marketplace of security is built of very, very complicated and very technical issues that nobody wants to deal with at the end of the day. Our job is to take all this complexity and try to simplify it. So every administrator that works with our product can understand what we're doing, and so hopefully to make it transparent to the end user. So when you and I use our computer, we're not all the time, this is what we need to do to get along with the security. So for most part, it needs to be transparent to the end user of the system. So that's our work, and I hope that we'll keep doing it.
Well, it's been an important and amazing journey for you and for Check Point. Just as we close, I'd like to ask a question at another kind of a higher level, and then one for a more kind of an individual level. The one on the higher sort of level, there's just been a dramatic rise in technological power, economic power in many different regions of the world, and this gives a kind of a rise in capacity and their ability to contribute, but also perhaps competitive threats. What regions, as you look across the globe, do you see as sort of exciting opportunities and potential greatest challenges for your business in the next sort of 3 to 5 years?
I think exciting opportunities are everywhere. I mean, the entire world, I mean, the internet, one of the things it does is unify the world and creates one thing. But again, for somebody looking at our world today, it's very hard to imagine and compare how we were 25 years ago or 20 years ago even. That everything became much more global, everything became connected, and that's not the situation that we've lived 20 years ago. Not that we lived bad life, we lived a very good life, but much more isolated, and there wasn't, not everything was global, not every product, not every piece of information was something that you can reach from every part of the world. And I think in terms of exciting market, there's a lot of exciting markets. I mean, it's, I mean, I think some areas in, I mean, there's a lot of areas in the world that haven't developed enough yet. There's a lot of areas in the world that haven't opened up enough yet. Whether we see threats coming from this direction, still, if I look at most of the innovative technology in the world, it still comes from the very developed market. I mean, Silicon Valley is still very important. The US is important. There are some countries in Europe that create innovation. There's not too many, there are a few innovative companies from other countries, but somehow each culture develops its own expertise. I mean, we know that manufacturing is done in Asia, and certain type of cameras are built in Japan, and still developing innovative product is still done a lot in Silicon Valley, a lot in Israel, a few other places too. And for somehow reason, we don't see a lot of that in coming from other countries. I think part of it is culturally, and part of it, by the way, may be dependent just in what I think is the benefit of Israel. That's, if you have a good local market, you're most likely to develop to that local market. So I'm sure that in the Chinese market, there's great product, I know, and they cater to the Chinese market. Why? Because if you're a developing product and if you have 1 billion people to sell to, why go far away? Why go to the other side of the world? If you're in the US and you have a pretty large, sizable market, you sell to that market, and it's great because the entire world imitates that and comes to the US to take that technology, and it becomes global leader. In Tel Aviv, it's the opposite. We don't have local markets, so we must develop to the global market, and that leads us to think outside of our easy to reach market.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you as a technology innovator, as an entrepreneur for building and growing Check Point's really scalable growth, and as a successful executive. I'd just like to ask, do you have any sort of advice that you would give to an innovator, a young entrepreneur, aspiring somebody who was in their 20s like you were over 20 years ago? What advice would you share with somebody who's just starting out?
I think there's a lot of advice. I think first, it's always good to go to good established companies to learn how to run the right business processes. I mean, in the 2 years before I started Check Point, when I joined, it was a company that's called now Orbotech in Israel. Back then it was Optrotech. I've learned so much from being in a larger company So that was a great experience for me. So now in Checkpoint, I still developed everything from scratch and so on, but the experience that I got from every place I was in my life, even for 1 or 2 months and definitely a year, was a huge experience. So I think looking around all the time and trying to absorb as much information, not just about what you're doing, but about how the world works, how you interact with customers, how the system, how to run the business and so on, it will help you when you grow and when you'll need that information eventually. The second is starting a startup can be a lot of fun, but it's also something you have to dedicate your entire life to. And it's hard to describe it, but in the first 3 years of Checkpoint, I really gave up everything that I have in life, and I really worked literally 18 hours a day with one single focus. That's not something you can easily do. That's a lot of, and especially when you run your own startup, it's not just the physical hours and so on. There is an emotional price that's very, very high when you have all the pressure on you. You must be successful, you must lead people, you must lead the investors, you must solve the problems to the customer, and it's just you. And you have no guarantee that it will succeed. When you're growing up, you have some track record or some already, there's nothing guaranteed that will happen again next year, but at least you know that you have a track record and you've solved some problems, so it will continue. It's already an ongoing process. And therefore, I think it's worth doing that only if you have an idea that you truly believe can revolutionize the world. Now, revolutionize the world doesn't have to be, it can be pretty small. I mean, when I started Checkpoint, I thought that I will revolutionize the world. I thought that I'll be the best in the world. And I hoped that it will be a company with 30 people and $3 million in sales. That looks to me like great. I mean, I'll provide the best technology, I communicate with the entire world and work with 30 people that I love. So I mean, it doesn't have to be, it's not the size, but you'll have to think that the idea is worth it and not just jump with different ideas. It's obviously very individual and different people believe in different things, but that's the main thing to think about. And in order to do that, an idea must be a real quantum leap in what it does. I mean, improving a process in 10% usually doesn't cut it. Doing something 10 times better has a chance. And that's kind of what people have to think about their ideas.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to interview. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Computer History Museum.
Thank you very much.